Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. This is, you'll have to bear with us in case something goes wrong because this is the first time I've had a guest on the show. And we have Josh Peck with us tonight. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be your first guest, and yeah, this will be fun.
Great. Well, to remind everybody what we've been doing, last week we looked at the timeline of Enoch, and we have a timeline sheet up there. This is the one that we kind of put together with it. And if you look to your left, we have his concept of 7,000 years was to break it up as 1 day per century. So as you can see over here, you've got week one starts, and there are 7 days. Each one of these is 100 years. So this would be 700 years for week one. And he mentions in the text that in the seventh day of week one is when I was born. And so Enoch, if you just go to Genesis and look at it, we did all this last week, but you'll find that he was 6:22 a.m. And a.m., of course, is the Jewish calendar, and it means from creation rather than from the birth of Christ. So that worked out perfectly. And then we go on down with all of these. And in our chart, we put the AM dates so you can see it's century. The first 100 years, 200 years on down. And then we put it AD, BC, and then the event. Week two is when the wickedness started, is all he said. Week three, it talked about flood and the Noahide laws being given, and then entering into the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, the way the scrolls talk about it's that we are lost because of an inherent sin nature, and somewhere along the line the Lord would send a Messiah, and it comes through Noah's line, and then they realized it comes through Shem's line, and then they just waited, and eventually it was obviously Abraham at the end of that age, Isaac and Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons, and so the nation of Israel starts, which is where the Messiah comes from. And so with all that, they understood all of those things. In another part of Enoch, it mentions that the Messiah is actually the 70th generation from Enoch. And so if you go to Luke chapter 1 or 2 and look at the genealogies, you can find Adam to Enoch. And then if you just start counting with Enoch's son and go forward, it'll be 70 generations to Jesus. So they have a lot of extra information. They knew he would be God incarnate. He would die for our sins. We talk on this channel a lot about 11Q13,
Yeah.
which is a Dead Sea Scroll that talks about the fact that the Messiah would come and die for our sins, that he is God incarnate, and the event that pays for our sin nature and reconciles us to God happens in 32 AD. And that's on that Dead Sea Scroll calendar, one Shemitah after the end of the 9th Jubilee of their age. So this is all, meshing perfectly with what is being taught. And then it's interesting that I think I mentioned last time, I may or may not have mentioned it, but when it talks about the flood, obviously that happens. But in the Testament of Noah, which is another Dead Sea Scroll, there is a place where Noah actually mentions he has nothing else to do but look at the books and try to figure out what happens in his day. And he's obviously talking about that. Now, this is just a passing glance, so I'm not sure what he was looking at. Evidently, he had more information than what we have. But again, this is all based on the Ethiopic, and then what little we have of Enoch from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's pretty cool that way. But still, we have to understand there may be a few differences in the words. So we did that, and then we get to week 4. Basically, the law of Moses is given, a tabernacle is created, and we get to week 5, and we talk about the temple being created. And of course, we have all the dates in there, and they mesh with the weeks and the days given here. Week 6, we get to the time of the ascension and the temple being burnt and Israel's dispersion. So it's interesting that it kind of skips over the Babylonian dispersion and focuses on the Roman one, which is a little more important apparently to Enoch. And so that happens, as we know, 32 AD, 70 AD, and then 132. And then in week 7, we have this odd point of in the last day, which is between 875 and 975, somewhere in that century, some sort of sevenfold wisdom is given. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But it basically goes on and talks about we get all the way down to the Great White Throne Judgment. And what's interesting is it mentions the Great White Throne Judgment as being in day 7 of week 10. And we know from Revelation that it's at the end of the millennial reign. So if we back up 1,000 years from here, we get to our century, which is between 1975 and 2075. So it's interesting to me to look at that. And it's in this time period, we should have a rapture, resurrection, a 7-year tribulation, the second coming, and the beginning of the millennial reign. And according to Enoch, it's sometime between 1975, which is already passed, and 2075. So we're doing this in 2021. So we're about halfway there. So it's really interesting for us specifically in this time period. But this is the chart that we had, and we're specifically going to look at that. So I thought we would pull up. Here's my version of Enoch, and it's in chapter 93. We've got all the weeks. Mm-hmm. And so let's just start by looking at week 7.
Sure.
And see what it says here. And then I'll give it over to Josh, and he's got some interesting ideas of what this actually might mean. But in this part, it says for the 7th week, and again, that would be somewhere between 275 and 975, and the last day or the last part of it, last day or two. So after the coming of Messiah, the start of the church age, and the expulsion of Israel, it says after that, in the 7th week, an apostate generation will arise. Their rebellion will manifest in many different ways. At its close, so the last century or two of this time period, 800 to 900, at its close, the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness will be rewarded with a 7-fold instruction concerning his creation. The only other thing I would mention is that the scrolls repeatedly talk about the plant of righteousness being Israel. The plant of righteousness is a nation that the Messiah eventually comes from. And so we're obviously talking about Jewish believers, if they're still elect and righteous of the righteous plant. So that's what the confusing part has been in interpreting this and saying that basically around 900 AD, there's got to be a group of Jewish believers, kind of like messianics of some sort, that arise. And that's nice, but whatever this 7-fold instruction is, I would like to really get a copy of that if it's in a book form, so it'd be pretty interesting. So let's turn it over to Josh here now and see what kind of insight he can give us.
Sure. So, yeah, this is the most fascinating week, except, well, maybe the 9th one. And I have some cool things on the 9th week too that we could get into later if you want. But the 7th week is probably the most fascinating one out of all the weeks, because it's the only one that's not really self-explanatory. All the other weeks are really easy to pinpoint exactly what it's saying, exactly what it's referring to. This one's a little different. The translations that I have, so from the Ethiopic version, I've been using the Charles translation, and it says, and after that in the 7th week shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate, and at its close there shall be elected the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness to receive 7-fold instruction concerning all his creation. And then the Dead Sea Scroll version, I'm the one that I quote is from Martinez, but it says, but all their deeds will be at fault, because it's fragmented. We don't have the whole thing, but it says from what we do have, but all their deeds will be at fault. At its close, the chosen ones will be selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of everlasting justice. They shall be given wisdom and knowledge 7-fold. They shall uproot the foundations of violence and the work of deceit in it in order to carry out justice. So really, really similar, really close. The Dead Sea Scroll version brings out a little bit more kind of interesting details. We're given a little bit more information, but I when I first read this, I've assumed, like many have, that this, because the apostate generation talked, that this might have something to do with the Catholic Church or the Dark Ages, because it was around that time, maybe something having to do with the rise of Islam. Some people have wondered if it has something to do with that. But to narrow it down, what we really need to do is first identify that group mentioned called chosen ones, who are selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of justice, from the Martinez Dead Sea Scroll version that I have in front of me. So, and the Ethiopic version translates that as, from the Charles translation, the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness. So from week 3, and I watched your video last week, by the way. You did a phenomenal job going through that. So if people missed it, they can go back and watch that. But Ken did a great job laying out with week 3. That's where we get the plant of righteousness. We find out what that means. It has to do with Abraham and the Jewish people. So we should be able to find, like Ken mentioned, we should be able to find a sect of Jewish people who were somehow called out from many Jews during that time. And this should also have something to do with wisdom and knowledge, or an instruction concerning his creation. And then even that has to do something with the number 7. So those are several things that we can look for. And I went through that for months trying to figure out what was going on. And I think my problem was, at first I was looking at the Dark Ages Catholic Church and the rise of Islam. But there's a whole other movement that I actually think now fits this really well, and it's the history of the Karaite Jews. So the Karaite Jews, there's still some debate as to exactly when they first sprung up, but most agree that they gained a substantial foothold somewhere between the 7th and 9th centuries. So that would fit within this timeline. One online publication actually puts it like this, quote, led by a Nasi prince claiming Davidic lineage, the Karaites attracted many scholars of distinction in biblical exegesis, law, Hebrew lexicography, and philosophy. So originally, the Karaite Judaism branched off from mainstream Talmudic Judaism, which, as you know and your audience knows, comes from the Pharisees anciently. Now, the Karaites absolutely rejected the notion of oral Torah, which I thought was really interesting, because back in the days of Jesus, there was another group that rejected oral Torah known as the Essenes. But the Karaite Jews, they preferred to recognize the written Torah as the supreme authority in religious law and theology, even borrowing from some of their traditions and interpretations. They actually borrowed from the Essenes, among other ancient Jewish groups, which I thought was really interesting, that connection there. It's also believed that Karaite Judaism may have formed as a reaction to the rise of Islam. And so, that leaves us with a couple of options on how to interpret it. If Islam is the apostate generation, and I don't think it is, but if it was, as some people say, and if Karaite Judaism rose as a reaction to it, then Karaite Jews could be, the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness. But as the prophecy says, if the Karaite Jews are the elect righteous, then what's the eternal plant of righteousness? Well, it's not Islam. That would be just Jews in general. So I think that simpler explanation, that the apostate generation from verse 9 of the Ethiopic version might not be describing Islam or Catholicism or anything like that. I think that might be describing Talmudic Judaism itself. That's the apostate generation. Because remember, and you've talked about this earlier before too, like I just mentioned, Talmudic Judaism sprang up after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, like right at the beginning of the Age of Grace. It was right in 75 at the Council of Yavne was when this whole Talmudic thing kind of started, or at least Orthodox Judaism as we know it today. It was formed from surviving Pharisees. So when we look through history, ancient Pharisees, because part of the translation I have says that there's a history of violence. There was certainly a history of violence there. You only need to read through the pages of the Gospels to find that. So Pharisees in any group developing from them would have this tradition and history of violence, and that might be what the Dead Sea Scroll version is talking about in that part of it. If Talmudic Judaism is the apostate generation, then it would make sense how the Karaite Jews would fulfill the rest of that prophecy. Not only were they, and I'll talk a little bit too about what that sevenfold instruction might be, because there's some interesting history and there's some possibilities. But not only were they given this, sevenfold instruction or knowledge and wisdom sevenfold. There's a couple different ways to interpret that. And that could be gained by putting the Torah first, including the creation account of Genesis, because it says in the prophecy that they were given this sevenfold instruction concerning all of creation. Maybe that's a reference to Genesis, possibly. But they also mainly rejected the traditions of the Pharisee turned Talmudic Jews. So they would fulfill the last part of that Dead Sea Scroll version, which says that, quote, they shall uproot the foundation of violence and the work of deceit in order to carry out justice. So that foundation of violence and works of deceit, I think could describe the Pharisees. So by rejecting Talmudic traditions, the Karaite Jews would have been uprooting that Pharisaical foundation. Other translations render that final part as to pass judgment on it rather than carry out justice. So it's not like God was sending the Karaite Jews in with swords to take care of it, like that kind of justice, but to pass a judgment on it. Here's another online source too that talks about Talmudic, or talks about Karaite Jews in comparing them against Talmudic Judaism. It says, quote, the best part of the Karaite intellectual effort was directed at proving the errors of the rabbinates. Their critical acuteness and thorough knowledge of rabbinical doctrines ensured the high level of their polemics, and their religious attack was accompanied by bitter social criticism of the Jewish leadership, the exilarchs, the geonim, heads of academies, and the dignitaries which surrounded them. So Enoch seventh week here is in my opinion, I don't think the more that I looked into this, I don't think Catholicism or Islam is that apostate generation. I think that what became Talmudic Judaism was, and now Karaite Judaism, here's where it gets tricky, because they didn't, at least not historically, not that we know of, it's not like they became Christians. The Karaite Judaism, they still would have been Jews. But it's still possible that God could have used them to pass this judgment against Talmudic Judaism's, that apostate generation. And that sevenfold instruction may have come through the Torah, elevating the Torah above the traditions, and instead of these Talmudic traditions. Historically, the Karaite Jews, because they were so different and set apart, they actually enjoyed protections that Talmudic Jews didn't have. So Talmudic Jews were being persecuted in certain areas, but the Karaites were so different that they enjoyed protection. So it's possible that could have been part of the judgment as well. Now, the main confusing part, the main tricky part in the whole prophecy is, what is the sevenfold instruction? And I actually, funny enough, I didn't plan it this way, but I have 7 possible interpretations of the sevenfold instruction. I don't know exactly what the sevenfold instruction is. I don't know if it's supposed to be sevenfold instruction or wisdom and knowledge sevenfold. There's a couple different ways to look at it, but I have an idea what it might have something to do with. So the Karaites taught on different topics in opposition to the Talmudic Jews of the time. And the exact number of categories of Karaite teachings, it varies depending on who you ask. But in all the sources that I looked at, their teachings seem to center around this list of 7. And I think this might possibly have something to do with what this sevenfold instruction is. So this list of 7 are what the Karaites typically are known for teaching about. First is biblical supremacy, so that's putting the Bible above the Talmud. 2, religious law. 3, Karaite dogmatics. 4, religious philosophy. 5, hermeneutic rules or biblical literalism. 6, Hebrew grammar. And interestingly enough, 7, natural science. And it's strange that was actually a part of it, but it was. So that's a possibility. Now, we also know another possibility. We know that the founder, whose name is Anon, wrote some teachings, and perhaps his body of work adds up to 7 somehow, or maybe his book with those of some of the other leaders that came after him. they also weren't perfect, so not everything they said and taught in those things would have been right, but maybe the correct stuff, the stuff that's actually God honoring, that's actually correct, maybe that somehow adds up to 7. After the founder Anan died, there were 7 who succeeded him in leading the Karaite group. So his son, his grandson, and then 5 others after that, before a really interesting piece of history happened, which I'll get to in a minute. But that may have something to do with it. Karaites, so this is possibility number 4. Karaites expanded into 7 regions: Israel, Egypt, Syria, Babylonia, Persia, Europe, and the Orient. So there's 7 regions involved. They actually had to translate their teachings into other languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, and others, because of this expansion. So it's possible, if we looked at every language that the Karaite teachings were translated into, that it could turn out that 7 or has something to do with the 7 regions, meaning that these were Karaites that spoke other languages in 7 regions around the world. So they received a sevenfold instruction, meaning one instruction in 7 different regions, 7 different major groups around the world. And if the teachings were translated into 7 languages, that could have something to do with it too. But even if they were just distributed into 7 regions, that's a possibility. Now here's where it gets interesting. As divergences multiplied throughout the Karaites, so you had it was kind of like the Essenes. You had like the faithful Karaites, but over time these little splinter groups started breaking up. These like heretic groups. So as these divergences multiplied throughout the Karaites, the faithful original followers actually emigrated to Jerusalem to adopt the so-called hermit life of the Essenes as mourners for Zion. That's how they describe themselves. And what's really interesting is when they did that, there were 7 representatives of that group that went and did that. So it's possible, I don't have history of this, but it's possible that since the Karaites seemed to borrow teachings from the Essenes, and since a group of faithful Karaites actually went to Jerusalem to live as Essenes, that at that time, maybe that's when they received their sevenfold instruction. Maybe they ended up realizing that Jesus is the Messiah, because an Essene belief system could definitely pave the way for that, as we've seen historically in the 1st century. But again, the problem is that we don't have documentation of that, so it's just a guess. That would connect with a possible hypothetical kind of underground group of Essenes that might still be around today that recognize Jesus as Messiah. There's rumors about that, but we don't have solid documentation that I'm aware of. There's just rumors about it. So that sevenfold instruction, that could have been, if that happened in history, that could have been from the Holy Spirit himself. Throughout Scripture, in a couple different places, the Holy Spirit's referred to with the number 7, like the sevenfold Spirit, and there's 7 aspects to the Holy Spirit, and that. And then lastly, my final 7th possibility of what this might mean. There was a famous Karaite writer of the time who is actually called the Grammarian of Jerusalem, and he wrote a comprehensive work in 7 parts. But unfortunately, I can't do much with this one because it's in Arabic and I don't know what's in it. So I don't know exactly what was in the founder's, Anan's writing, and I don't know what was in the Grammarian of Jerusalem, what was in his writing. But apparently it was in 7 parts, but it's in Arabic. So it was really influential to the Karaites at the time, but no idea what's in it. I have not found a translation of it. So as far as the sevenfold witness and the 7th week, that's kind of where I'm at right now with it. A lot of possibilities. There's definitely a lot of speculation. But what I think is most intriguing is that they actually went to Jerusalem to live as Essenes, and it would not surprise me if it turns out, if we find out some documentation someday, that they actually ended up accepting Yeshua and actually ended up becoming Christians, and maybe that's what the sevenfold instruction was. So at this time, that's my best guess.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So the grammarian that you were talking about, what date was he again, approximately?
I believe it was somewhere between the 9th and 11th century from the source that I looked at. So if it was into the 11th century, then that's kind of late. So I don't know if the 7th week is similar to how the second week talks a little bit about the flood, but the flood isn't in the second week. It talks a little ahead. We could have something like that going on, because some of the stuff that I was looking at, a lot of the dates I couldn't really pinpoint down, but it would say like, between the 7th and 9th century, or the 9th and 11th century. Well, if it's the 11th century, then that kind of goes outside from what we're looking at. But it's possible that week could be talking about something that starts in that week, just like week 2, you get into the angels coming down, and you get into like all the bad stuff happening on earth that prompts the flood later. And we could have something like that, but I don't know that for sure. I just know that we get that in week 2. So it could be as late as the 11th century. If that's the case, then I would probably say that's probably not it then.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm thinking if we can find the writings of the one that started the movement, Anon, I think you said. Is that in existence anywhere, even if it's in an odd language?
Yeah, I think it's in Arabic for sure. I haven't been able to find a copy of that though, but also I don't know where to look, so I kind of reached as far as I could go there. There might be English translations out there, but again, he also from what I've been able to gather, it's also hard to get information on the Karaites, because the information usually that we get are from Jewish historians and scholars that are typically Orthodox. And so when you read their stuff, they're very, very critical of the Karaites, which, understandable. But it's kind of hard to really get accurate information outside from kind of the emotional stuff that's attached to it. But if there are English translations, I don't know where they are. There very well could be. But from what I gather too, when Anon first started, he had like a certain solid way of teaching, and then later on, either he or his followers, it's hard to pinpoint this stuff, but somehow it diverged. Either he got weird after a while and started saying some weird stuff, or his followers did, or the leaders that he appointed did. But somehow it started in these splinter groups. So it could be that if somebody found like a later writing of Anon, it might be something completely different than what it was when the group first started. So it would be interesting if there's English translations out there, or even in Arabic or something that we can find somebody to translate. It'd be interesting to read what he wrote, if there was anything correlating to a sevenfold instruction in his first writings, and then look at the later writings and see, did he really like go off, or is that something that just kind of the more Orthodox Jews say today? It's hard to know for sure till we can get those writings ourselves.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'll do some research and see if I can't find something along those lines. Parallels to what you're talking about is interesting, because we have church fathers that say, for instance, that John the Baptist was part of the school of the prophets. Mm-hmm. And they talk a lot about his school and who was his disciples and things like that. After John died, several of his disciples, of course, went and became Christians and followed the Messiah. There's a few that stayed behind and wasn't sure. And then we have Simon Magus, who was a student that went to Egypt to study magic, came back and somehow duped them all into thinking he was Messiah, kind of took over that school. And that's how we have the Gnostics being started. So that's a normal thing of Satan, basically. If the Karaites started out almost as seen in concept, either him or after his time, a disciple or something changing the story, corrupting it. So stuff like that would happen. I think it's interesting talking about this whole concept. And again, not sure about the sevenfold instruction or just receiving instruction sevenfold. Mm-hmm. But along those lines, the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to indicate that there were guardians in Essenes. And that is a combination of the gift of tongues and the gift of prophecy. The Apostle Paul talks about it's be nice to have tongues, but pray that you can prophesy, because that's really more beneficial.
Yeah.
And the way it's described is really interesting, because that really would make a guardian. If you go back and you think of Elijah, who told the king of Israel what the enemy was planning to do tomorrow, and he's discussing it right now in his special chambers, but Elijah's saying, I know exactly what he just said 2 seconds ago. And I'm telling you, here's the plan. You can't not win in a situation like that. And
Right.
so here's the deal. If you have a guardian that has both the gift of tongues and the gift of prophecy, you could walk up and talk to him, and he'd be able to talk with you no matter what language that you speak. And if the governmental authorities, for instance, were going to raid my house tomorrow at 9, then we'd go ahead and have our Bible study. We'd run down the street to Perkins at 8:30, hang out and eat lots of pancakes, and we'd come back at 10 o'clock, and the authorities would be scratching their heads going, we can't find them. We don't know where they're at. They'd never find us because I'd always be one step ahead if I was a guardian.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting, that whole concept. And we see in Revelation, someone guides the children of Israel, the believers, to Petra. And I've often wondered, if everybody knows where Petra's at, where they're at, why don't they just scoop them up?
Right.
You can't find them because they're always somewhere else. And so looking at these, I say that because in the text, it seems to indicate that the right before the establishment of the kingdom, there'll be a major persecution. We would call that the persecution in the 7-year period. And it talks about guardians being there taking care of them. And so I know a lot of our brothers and sisters thinks the gifts have completely stopped, and maybe they have, maybe they haven't, for us. But if we had guardians and Essenes that were 100% accurate prophets, healers living to be 120 years and stuff like that, first century, and the gifts continued from them into the Christians, of course, believers in Messiah, and we have them at the end with the Jews, and the church fathers seem to indicate the gifts don't stop. They go all the way up to the second coming. So if you pull all that together, and I'm just saying if all of that is true, we have had Essenes, guardians, around all the time. And if the Karaites basically came back, went to Jerusalem, and then kind of sort of disappeared, or maybe a break off of them, maybe modern day Karaites are not exactly the same, but it makes me think that somewhere on this planet there is a Essene group that has the entire temple library.
Mm-hmm.
That would make perfect sense. And they're not in the limelight. They don't want to be in the limelight because their job is to protect the library. And that's just something out of my head based on all those scrolls. If you put them together, that's got to be where it is. So now you're saying that there's a good possibility that 900 to 1000 AD, when the Karaites started, there was a group of Jews basically that woke up, realized that the traditions we've been taught for the last 1,000 years they don't make sense. They've been added, so we reject those. We want to just go back to the scriptures. And if you do that, you're going to see things differently. And so you'd go back to Jerusalem and try to figure this stuff out. So I think it's really amazing. It's got to be something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
You may or may not be right, but you've got to be in the ballpark. So I think the next thing for us to do would be to try to find information on Anon. Or see, one reason they could have went to Jerusalem, not so much to try to start up the nation of Israel again, but everybody knows that there's records in those caves.
Right.
And they've known that for centuries. I mean, in the church archives, there's every 2 or 3 centuries, there's somebody that at least says they went to Jerusalem and they dug around and they found these manuscripts. And some of them are real, some of them are faked, but everybody's known the legend. And of course, 1948 comes and obviously they're real because we have a lot of them now. So I think it's all connected.
Yeah, and what I found out too is when that group of Karaites actually went to Jerusalem, they didn't go to live in Jerusalem. They went to mourn for Jerusalem from Qumran. They actually went to go dwell in the caves and live in the caves of Qumran, just like the Essenes did. So yeah, I agree. There's got to be some connection there. Something I've wondered too, because I could not find, and there might be some record of this, but I so far I haven't been able to find it. I couldn't find record of a group of Karaites that accepted Jesus, and I've wondered, why, and something that I've wondered too, if there is a group of kind of underground Essenes, if they believe, anybody that believes in Jesus, when the rapture happens, they're out of here, they're gone. So who's left for the tribulation period then? And we know that with Israel, there's a type of spiritual blindness. It's not like God forces people to not believe or anything, but there is like a type of blindness there. So when I was reading about the Karaites, I couldn't make sense of, why is there no record of their of them just becoming Christians, or of them becoming saved, or accepting Jesus as Messiah. I mean, especially since they were so close with the Essenes. And it could be that they did and there just wasn't record of it, though it seems like the way that the Orthodox Judaism is, if that happened, they would want to use that like against them, because a lot of the stuff I was reading, it's from Orthodox sources, and they really don't like these Karaites. So anytime they can get a little dig in, they will. And it seems like if there was something in the historical record about them accepting Jesus, that the Orthodox Jews would have used that against them. I couldn't find anything, but I wonder if it has anything to do with, possibly, because when the rapture happens, well, they would be gone. So who would be left to carry on that role on into the tribulation? And so I'm not sure. Do you think? I wondered if you thought about that. Do you think that if there's a group of Essenes, I mean, I would think that just on the surface we would think that they would be Christians, but then again, if they are, then they're not going to be here during the tribulation. So who do you think would be those during the tribulation, or do you think that it's possible maybe some of them don't know Jesus yet?
It's possible that they don't. It's possible that they do. I mean, many of us have sons and daughters that grow up in the church and they kind of sort of believe, and they don't really believe. And then if the rapture was to happen right now, mom and dad and most of the family's gone. Why didn't I go? Well, think about it. You know the story, and then they immediately get saved. That's going to happen to at least some people after not the flood, but after the rapture. So it could be a bunch of stuff like that too. So there might be some believers and some non-believers in Messiah. And so I don't know. It's just really interesting to think of all that, put all that together.
Yeah, especially the time that we're living in. With week 9, I actually found something really cool. So week 9, the exact so the whole prophecy, the whole 10-week prophecy is what's called chiastically structured, which means the top mirrors the bottom. They call it chiastic because it's like the Greek letter chi or chi, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but it looks like a letter X. And it's basically, you see this all over in Hebrew writing, but it's like a mirror image. It's the top line will mirror the bottom line. The next idea will, so the whole prophecy, I realized is like that, because weeks 2 and 9 both talk about something that happens in the week or in the middle of the week. All the other ones from 3 to 8 talk about at its close. And then 1 and 10 have their own thing. But 2 and 9 say something about like in the middle or in the midst, or something about the middle of that week. And what's really cool is if you map it out, the middle, the exact middle of week 9 is 2025. And we've talked about that quite a bit, how the year 2025 is the start of what, according to the Essenes, would be the final jubilee of our age. And I found a whole bunch of stuff in that chiastic structure of this prophecy pointing to stuff like that. But yeah, because that week is from 1675 to 2375. Exactly in the middle is 2025. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but I came across that and I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. And it's interesting to see types of poetry like that from Hebrew and other sources. And it just lets you know that it's old. I think a lot of times if we're trying to fake something, we would do it the way we do it now, and we don't maybe not even know things like that. So that's a really good indication of the age or the time period, if it's been faked or not, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And it even goes into, because when you compare those weeks, it goes into why, because I couldn't figure out, why does week 2 seem to be talking about the flood when the flood doesn't happen until week 3? And I think it's because of this chiastic structure. If you're going to have that, and especially if there's a lot of allusions to comparisons between like the rapture and the flood, just like Noah saved days of Noah kind of stuff, just like God saved Noah, God will save us too. But when you read these together, it's really interesting. So week 2 says, and after me there shall arise in the second week great wickedness, deceit shall have sprung up, and in it there shall be the first end. So that's interesting. The first end. What would the second end be then? Would that be in week 9? But then it says, and after it is ended, unrighteousness shall grow up, and a law shall be made for the sinners. So then week 9, it says, after that, in the 9th week, the righteous judgment shall be revealed to the whole world, and all the works of the godless shall vanish from the earth, and the world shall be written down for destruction, and all mankind will look to the path of uprightness. Now, that's obviously talking a lot about Jesus' return and stuff after the tribulation. But when you compare those, it makes sense why it sounds like the flood in week 2. It's because the theme is the same as week 9. And this is something really phenomenal I've noticed about this prophecy, the whole 10 weeks. It's more about theme than exact time. There are exact times. I mean, the whole thing is a century for a day exactly. But like if you try to date Jesus, theme-wise, he's right in the middle of this prophecy. If you just look at themes, if you look at years, he's like a little bit over into one week and not the other. So like in week 2, I think the middle of that week was 1050. And it talks about how, a man will be saved from it, talking about Noah. Well, he was born in 1056. So it's not exactly to the year, but in theme, he's in the middle of that week. He was saved out of this mess. And, in the second week, or well, that would be the flood in the 3rd week, but it's talking about it in that week. And then when you have week 9, well, it's in the midst or in the middle of that week too by theme. So I can't say, I would never say like, 2025, that's the rapture. Who knows when it's going to be. But I think that we're around that time, somewhere around that time, kind of generally in theme. I think if the Essene calendar is right, and if the Enoch apocalypse of weeks is right, and it has been dead on so far. And like you said, it can't really be faked, because people a long time ago thought that maybe the Ethiopic church or the Ethiopians might have forged some of this stuff. But now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we could compare them, and some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are lost, but the Ethiopians wouldn't have known which parts were going to be, degraded due to time. That would have been impossible to know that. They wouldn't have known what parts to fake and what ones to have match the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if they match, then we can be confident that this is exactly, or at least fairly close to what was actually written 200 years, 300 years before the time of Christ. And so all of those prophecies, when you look at just the accurateness of what's predicted in those times, after the time of Christ, it's right down to a T. So if all of that is right, it stands to reason that maybe what it says about week 9 is correct as well. And since only week 2 and week 9 say anything or point to anything about the middle of a week, and week 2 definitely had something happen in the middle of that week with the birth of Noah, then maybe the middle of our week, we have some really prophetically significant things to look forward to. And so, again, 2025, I don't know if that exact year will be significant, but I think just around generally in that time, according to the Essenes and according to the Book of Enoch here, it should be prophetically significant. So what an exciting time to be alive.
Amen to that. Yeah, just kind of looking at these things, and there's got to be a lot more to that. And just looking at those kind of things, I noticed that in Revelation, where you've got the 7 churches, when you start looking at the time periods, the middle part is much bigger than any of the others, right. And the first 2 and the last 2 seem to overlap, and none of the others overlap. So there's all these little almost artistic ways of things overlapping and doing that, like what you're talking about. That is really interesting.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. I haven't looked at the churches in that light. I'm gonna have to go back and read those now. But yeah, if those line up too, then that kind of even more points to this sort of thing. So maybe it's at the beginning and the end of ages where, well, we already know things really start to happen, but why those middle parts are so large and vast. That's really cool.
Yeah. Let's see here. I think we had a question.
Sure.
And let's see here. John asks, what about the Cochin Jews and their Tanakh? The Cochin Jews would have left at like around 720 when the northern Jews would have went for the 10 tribes migrating. So that would have been 722 BC. And this would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 AD, so quite a bit different. Now, they do have an Old Testament. They've kept with it. They don't have the minor prophets and those kind of things, or didn't. But then they had the missing 5. So those are definitely something to look at. The 5 missing prophets that they have are recorded according to the church fathers as actually existing, or heading rather, the school of the prophets. Which means if we had everything from Qumran in its complete form, we would have their writings too. I mean, you don't have the head of the school being a prophet, writing a book on prophecy, not having that in the library somewhere. So, but that's a good thing. We need to keep a good look at all of those.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point too about the timings of these some of these days is those between 2 and 9. It says at its close. So when it talks about the close, I think it's talking about like that final 100 years, that final day that would be within that week. And so yeah, we would, and that helps us narrow it down. So we would be looking for something within that 100-year span. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, it may be connected in some way, but again, we need to go back and find more about the founder and anything that's still around. I had another question here. Basically says, can you see a scenario where Christ won't return soon, judge the churches and prune or graft in light of Israel's judgment and our superficialness?
Well, I mean, we don't really know when the rapture is going to happen. We don't know when Christ is going to return. So we certainly wouldn't want to set dates. For all we know, there could be something odd with the calendar that might have got lost that we don't have a piece to that could change things. We maybe we're a few years off, or we never really know, or just maybe these calendars aren't intended for today. It could even be that. So if I actually just completed a book called The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, and in that I talk about a lot of prophecies connected with the scene stuff, but near the end, and actually all throughout the book, but I say that as interesting as this calendar is and as interesting as these prophecies are, we don't ever want to lift them above what Christ has said, or we don't want to lift them above scripture in general. And setting specific dates, and saying this or that is going to happen is always a mistake. But I think that as long as we're honest about what we're doing and we're just speculating and throwing out possibilities, and maybe if these prophecies have been right so far, and if that were to continue, then this is what we should expect. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but absolutely, if the person said Christ might not come back soon, it might be when he comes, he's going to come quickly, but it might not be for couple hundred years. I personally don't think it's going to be that long, but God is God. He can do what he wants. So, there's nothing set in stone biblically where these things have to be fulfilled in our lifetime. It sort of just seems like that there's a strong possibility they will be, based on how things are unfolding just throughout the past few decades, especially with Israel becoming a nation again.
Yeah, I kind of say the same way. I mean, we can't, I love to set dates. So if I can find a prophecy and then it ended in the past, and sure enough, it took place, I love to mention those, because prophecy is a great way of saying things. But what, next week could be so many days after something, or it might fit something. We want to be real careful and say, well, something has to happen sometime soon. And so we've actually got a lot of prophecies that are going to happen sometime too. We've got the Psalm 83 war. We've got the destruction of Elam, which is the coast of Iran. That's Jeremiah 49. You've got Ezekiel 37 or 38 and 39, the Gog-Magog war. And then we've got Isaiah 17, the destruction of Damascus, and quite a few others. We've got the Gaza situation that we thought we might be seeing this last couple of weeks ago, and it got really close, the same kind of thing happening, but it looks like that's been pushed back. And the situation is going to rebound, start all over again. So, but there's a lot of things to look for.
Yeah.
But yeah, we want to be really careful in that kind of stuff. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Here's a question. And let's see here. Josh, you mentioned the midpoint of Enoch's 10th week prophecy beginning in 2025. The same is true for Ezra's 40-year prophecy. The midpoint is 2025. Do you see any connection there? Thank you.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Ezra's 40-year prophecy because I've been so focused on Enoch's 10 weeks for longer than 10 weeks myself. But so I don't know about that. One quick correction. It's not the middle of the entire 10-week prophecy because that would be, I think, 425 BC or something. But it's the middle of the 9th week, which according to if you time out all the years and everything, we're in the 9th week, and the middle of the 9th week of that whole prophecy is 2025. And so what I was saying before is that could be significant because according to the Essene calendar, 2025 is, if we got the dates right, if we were understanding it right, then 2025 is the year that starts the final jubilee of the age of grace, the whole 2,000-year age, which means the age comes to an end at 2075. So I was just making the point that there's a connection there. Ken probably knows a lot more about Ezra's 40-year prophecy than I do. I'd be interested what you have to say, Ken.
Yeah, there's a lot of these things point to the same time period as Enoch. So Enoch's got us, what we're looking for is the rapture or second coming tribulation period, somewhere between 1975 and 2075. And a lot of the other prophecies tend to go a little further out. But there are the one prophecy from the Ezra apocalypse does talk about, it seems to be, we need to go back and look at it, but it seems to be talking about an event, probably second coming, as happening around the 230s, 240-ish, rather than 260 to 270-ish. And so, again, that's right in the ballpark of what Enoch is talking about. It's something that we need to look at, but it is an interesting thing when you can compare things like that. It's the only one that seems to be, if you're going to take a group of possible times of the second coming, it's the earliest. So 25, 30, 32, 30, 30, 40, something like that. But yeah, we've been talking about that, and you can take Genesis and just add up the timeline and get up to the Genesis and Kings Chronicles. You can get up to the destruction of the temple in 3,338 years after creation. And so everybody agrees that was 586 or 587 BC. So that puts creation at the 3925 mark, more or less. And you can do that through the Seder, Jasher, and several other things, giving us that. There's prophecies about from Daniel about the death of the Messiah, and from Daniel about 1948 and 1967, and that fits all with that time frame. And then the 11Q13, the Melchizedek document, basically saying that the Messiah was to die for our sins one Shemitah after the end of the 9th Jubilee of their age. And their age ended in 75. So if you take 75 minus 50, that's 25. And then just add 7 to that, 25 plus 7 is 32. So give or take a year, and we're not trying to, be dogmatic, it's down to this year, but that's pretty close, if you think about it. So we've got 4 prophecies, a bunch of things from the Bible, from other Jewish documents and history books, and then the Dead Sea Scroll prophecy, all pointing to this time period. And with that, we can't really say anything about the second coming per se, because we had the same thing with the first coming. The
Right.
age ended in 75 AD, and we've got Jesus being born in 2 BC, dying in 32, church being started in 32, destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70, the Alexandrian Jewish temple in 73, and then 75, the Yavne Council and the age ending. But Israel still hung around until the 130s when they were finally dispersed. So you have like 150-year time frame there for everything to happen. Yeah. And so I believe that, everything started when Israel came back, which is what the Dead Sea Scrolls, Isaiah, and the Church Fathers all seem to indicate. So 1948 going forward, like 120 years would get us to 67, possibly plus a 7-year tribulation period, which would get us to 2075. But remember, Revelation says those days will be shortened.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's a whole lot of things that we could think about. It seems like they were elongated back then. They went over, and so a lot of things could happen, but we do need to keep our minds on all these. And I think the closer we get to when these prophecies would happen, the more we'll understand. And that's what Church Father Irenaeus has said. Once Israel comes back, whenever that is, which came to be 1948, then more and more of the prophecies will begin to fulfill. And the more prophecies we see that have the same symbols, eventually, when we get toward the end, we will know exactly what those things mean, and there won't be any question about it. So we're beginning to get to that point now.
Yeah, and what's really cool too is I saw somebody in the chat say, "Oh no, not 2075," and I remember when I first learned that I had the same thought too. But like Ken just said, really important to keep in mind. There's a lot of events that can happen like at any point. So at the end of the last age, at the end of the age of Torah, Jesus came the first time pretty early in that final jubilee, and was crucified in what we think 32. So if that model repeats itself, we could have Jesus is coming as early as that, possibly, because we don't know how much time between the end of the tribulation, the beginning of the next age. We don't know if there's time there. For example, all the nations have to learn how things are going to run now. They all have to. There's new rules. They have to go do tabernacles. If they don't, they're going to get hit with plague and drought and stuff. So what does that process look like? How do they learn? Like how does that information get disseminated across the earth? There's things like that. But also, one thing that I've been thinking about lately, and this is interesting to me. I've always thought that, and it probably is like this, but we don't really know for sure. I've always thought that rapture happens, and probably that year is going to be the beginning of the tribulation. But we know that the rapture doesn't begin the tribulation. The beginning of the tribulation happens with the confirming of the covenant. We don't really have anything telling us how long of a period there is between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. The rapture could have happened, if God willed it that way, could have happened back in Paul's time, and we could have been in this 2,000-year gap, until the beginning of the tribulation. But there's nothing really locking the rapture with anything. So it could be that we get a rapture fairly early, and then maybe a considerable amount of time goes by. And the more I think about that, it's like, for one thing, if the 24 elders, what John sees when he's first caught up, if that represents raptured believers, and I for a variety of reasons, I believe it does. Well, they already have their rewards. They have crowns and all the stuff that's promised in the first 3 chapters of Revelation to believers. Those 24 elders already have that before Jesus breaks the first seal. So they've already been rewarded. How long does it take to reward everybody if it happens before the tribulation, after the rapture? So let's say there's a long period of time there. Now on earth, imagine how deceptive that would be to people. Rapture happens, world's full of unbelievers that don't really know anything, but then 7 years come and go, and no return of Jesus, no Antichrist, no nothing. Well, they're going to breathe a sigh of relief, a very false sigh of relief. So, I mean, I am not going to be dogmatic about that, but it's a possibility that you could have a rapture kind of pretty early, and then a long period of time before the tribulation even starts. So, and the only reason I even bring that up isn't to teach that as gospel truth, but to just say there's different ways this could work out. So don't be disheartened by the year 2075. That still technically can be in our lifetimes, but that's for the end of the age. We would have to have the tribulation end at some point, around or before that time, possibly. Some of these ages tend to kind of bleed into one another, like Ken just mentioned, with the end of the age of Torah and the beginning of the age of grace. While you can put an exact year on it, the events don't culminate in that 1 year. You have them kind of bleeding through the end of one age and beginning of another. So there's a lot of different ways that could play out. So just don't be disheartened by the number 2075. There's a lot of things that could happen before that.
Yeah, the one thing I think we could probably safely say is the rapture, second coming, probably won't be after 2025.
Right.
At least I hope not either. I wouldn't make it then either. So somebody in the chat room was saying, 2075, I won't make it.
Yeah.
Most of
I
us
was
would.
doing the math. I'll be in my 90s, so I'm probably not making it either. I don't think I'm going to last that long.
Yeah, unless we can find that Essene herbal medicine book and live into our 120s.
Exactly.
That's my next hopeful thing here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a good study. Again, just to kind of recap, we're thinking that, well, the script, the manuscript says that there is basically a Jewish group that leaves the apostasy of that day, or that week rather, and the apostasy would be from the Jewish group. So it would have to be the Pharisee Sadducee group that reject Messiah and becomes Orthodox Judaism. And so at that time period, there's a group that leave that or reject that thought. And that almost has to be Karaites, except the Karaites we know today don't quite fit that. But as we know, there's always splinter groups and other things like that. But apparently something like that did start in that particular time period. And so what we want to do is try to find anything from their founder or any other sources like that. I know a few Karaites, and they're really interesting folk. One friend of mine was talking about how, they all learned that you're supposed to say a prayer every time you eat. Depending on what you eat, it's a different kind of prayer. If you're going to have a big meal, you could say one and be done with the whole thing. And then he became a Karaite, and he said, I realized that that's for priests in the temple, or people going to the temple for a festival or something. And that's not me, and there's no temple, so there's no reason for me to do temple rituals. So we just put all that aside and go forward. And that's pretty interesting. He has a good heart for God, and he knows about Jesus, but he's not really saying anything about it. But that's pretty interesting. And again, if they wholeheartedly accepted Jesus as Messiah, they would have been definitely ridiculed by that over the centuries, and there's no real record of it. So there's a lot of things about that, but it's got to be something along those lines. If they went to Qumran, as some of the writers say, to mourn for Jerusalem, I'm thinking, but also dig in the caves. You find more things, and things happen. So there's records of people digging for scrolls. There's records of people taking scrolls somewhere. And so I still think that we have a good temple library somewhere being protected by what the scrolls call guardians. And if we're living close to the time period, we may be able to see some of this stuff, because since the Dead Sea Scrolls proper have come out, we have had a lot of Jews become Messianic believers.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic to see that. That's growing by leaps and bounds, believing in Messiah. And you can see why, because the whole idea is the Muslims are saying, this is our land, you're usurpers, you need to get out. Yeah, but we dug in the dirt and found writings from our ancestors. Obviously, this is our land. Mm-hmm. So it's really important that they show everybody the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it proves that they're in their land. Major, major deal. But if you believe that, if you believe that's really written by your ancestors, you need to read it and see what your ancestors said. And when you read it and see what your ancestors said, again, Messiah comes to die for your sins, the God-man incarnate, and that happened in 32 AD, among other things, and all these other things that happen. It's, a lot of them are thinking now. A lot of them are becoming believers. Some of them are not becoming believers, but are actually making public statements like, well, we've been lied to. Mm-hmm. Why didn't the rabbis simply say there was this crazy, wacky Essene cult that taught this stuff, kind of like Christians, and they were finally gotten rid of? Why didn't they at least mention it? Why all the hush hush? And if we study anything found in a scroll somewhere where we have a rabbinic curse on us, why is it so dangerous if it's just a wacky cult? So a lot of them are really, really thinking about this. And so it's amazing. We can
Yeah,
take a couple minutes if you have some time to look at some more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go for it. And yeah, I'll just mirror what you were saying. Is I actually ended my book with that. One of the main things, it's interesting talking about prophecy, and we can certainly learn a lot from seeing writings and stuff. But one of the most exciting things to me is seeing just the revival that this is bringing about. It seems like the more Jewish people actually realize this history, they realize that, oh, it's not just the Orthodox, Talmudic, Pharisaical history. There's a whole other section here. And this section, the Essene section, they were known as righteous and holy. They weren't corrupt like the Pharisees were. And they, Jews today, by and large, have had this history removed from them. And so, I mean, I want to do anything I can to offer that back to them any way that we can. I think doing these studies helps out a lot. Oh, we should mention too, we're going to be doing a virtual conference with Skywatch TV, defenderconference.com. I've already had the pleasure of getting a sneak peek at Ken's presentation. He got a look at mine, and actually a lot of what we're talking about today, Enoch's weeks and stuff, that's one of my presentations. Ken's giving a presentation as well, but if you guys want to check that out, it's defenderconference.com.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that definitely we want to do that. Yeah, my presentation is on 11Q13, the one we were talking about. My favorite Dead Sea Scroll.
Mine too.
Although the commentary on Habakkuk and Nahum is running way up there pretty close. Those things are amazing.
Yeah.
But let's see here. Yeah, one person says, Ken just asked the same question I've been asking all my life. If you have to hush stuff up, I go digging.
That's
so
right.
Amen to that. When someone tells you don't read Daniel 9, why? Because if I get a calculator out and a calendar, give or take a year or something, I know approximately when Messiah comes. And God didn't say, if you repent, I will send him. God just said, this is the date it happens. And God's not a liar. So he had to have come, before the destruction of the temple in approximately 32-ish AD. So there's a lot of stuff like that. And then the other manuscripts, it's amazing. It's something we really need to think about. And remember, we could have been grown up in a house that said, don't mention the name of Jesus. Christian stuff is junk, either pagans or Muslims or Jews or whatever, or just non-believing people, and been trained not to look at this stuff. And so we need to understand that there are brothers. We're all brothers and sisters. We don't need to be trying to kill each other. We need to be trying to share this information. And the Dead Sea Scrolls say what they say. The Old Testament says what they say. The Talmud says what it says. So you can read them and make the decision for yourself, as you should. But don't let anybody tell you don't read something. So that's always, every time someone tells me that, it's usually a Christian cult telling me not to read a part of the Bible or something.
Yeah.
And it's always weird that way.
Oh, I guess I can mention too that we Ken and I had actually put together a print version of the Essene calendar. If you guys are interested in that, it's at his website and at mine, so BibleFacts.org or DailyRenegade.com. But it's the same calendar you get for free online. But if you want to hang it on your wall, and you get the Dead Sea Scroll on the top and regular calendar on the bottom. So figure I'll just make mention of that if people are interested in checking that out.
Yeah, it'll be good. I'm looking forward to doing some more stuff with Skywatch this fall, and your book coming out. And it's just really neat how we have more and more people beginning to do this. The only person that I knew before I got into it, or about the same time, was Randall Price. Mm-hmm. He's done a lot of archaeological digs over there, and he is a professor at Liberty University. And so there's a handful of us that are doing things and with the different scrolls. But so, okay. Somebody said they think they might be getting the calendar, so that's good.
Great.
Anything else you would like to mention, Josh?
Not anything that comes off the top of my head. Just I think if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to answer. People can, if they want to get a hold of me, they can find me on Facebook, dailyrenegade.com. They can email me, joshpeckdisclosure@gmail.com. I'm happy to take questions there too. And I just really appreciate the time and getting to talk about Dead Sea Scrolls. And it is great that, like you said, more people are getting more interested in this. And so I'm hoping that, through your work, because you definitely inspired me. The only reason I'm into this is because of all the work you've been doing years before I even got into ministry. So I really owe a lot to you, Ken, and I really appreciate that. So, but yeah, so I have that new book coming out. Ken's got a new compilation book that it looks like it's going to be released at the same time as mine, and we're going to do that through Skywatch TV. So you're actually going to get to see some Skywatch TV programs with me and Ken sharing a stage together. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And people can look, keep their eyes on skywatchtv.com for information regarding that. That'll probably be later this year sometime.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, we'll go ahead and say goodnight to everybody. And what we'll try to do, I think Josh and I are both going to do this, and hopefully you guys too out there. If you run across the founder of the Karaites and any kind of thing that's written, especially anything about their belief in Messiah or what they may have believed back then, or anything along those lines, let us know. Yes. We'll try to do that research. And if we find it, we'll be back and we'll let you know what we found.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
So, okay, I will go ahead and say goodnight, and we'll be back. I won't be here for our normal Thursday night Q&A because I will be at a prophecy conference in Emporia, Kansas. And so we'll be back next Monday. So God bless you guys and good night.
Have a good night. God bless.